All right. Welcome, everybody. If you're in here in this room, if you're online on Facebook, if you're in the chat room, welcome, welcome, welcome. It's super exciting. This is a special edition of Third Thursday Book Discussion because we have a special guest. Nancy Menees Hardesty is with us, and we have read her book, and we're going to discuss her book, The Bonnet Book. Welcome, Nancy.
Thank you.
It's so good to, I've emailed you a few times. It's nice to talk to you in person. And I have to say, just before we start, I really enjoyed, you got a lot of good attention on the video you created for us last spring.
Oh, yes?
For our online book author festival.
Yes.
It was so well done with the music and the interview. It was just everything. We just you got some good reactions on that. So,
what that is, let me tell you, that's California stuff. So California has a lot of indie publishers and indie authors. And the person who was controlling that was Matthew Felix, who was my editor and publisher. And he had written 3 books of his own, and then he set out to help other people doing this. And he's a master, just a master.
Well, awesome. Well, he did a great job with helping with that for sure. I was. So, Nancy, I'm going to read a little bit about you first, and then we'll kind of get into your book. I'll ask you some questions. And
all right.
Nancy was born in Illinois and raised in St. Louis, Missouri, and moved to San Francisco, California in 1969. Nancy spent 6 years researching and writing the Bonnet Book. She had family journals and artifacts and the extensive help of her mother, Mary K. Menees, Bonnie Spencer's daughter-in-law. And so that brings me to it. You talk about it in the book, and a lot of us may have read it, but some of us watching may not. How did you start down this journey of writing the Bonnet Book?
Well, a couple of things happened. First of all, my husband and I managed teenage Mexican soccer players on 4 teams and our 3 sons for 10 years. And I wrote 1,000 pages about it. So the year after my son got married, I signed up to go to Stanford University Adult Education Night School, thinking I wanted to publish the soccer book. And in the second course, one of the first assignments was to write a 300-word essay about a member of your family. And I thought about it over the weekend, and I decided I would write about my grandmother, Bonnie. And I wrote what is the first chapter of this book. And I knew that she had done these poems during the temperance time, and I just arbitrarily put her on the stage in her white dress, and by golly, I started feeling her heartbeat and the perspiration going down the back of her neck, and I just couldn't stop. I just felt like I tapped into her bloodline in 1900. And so I turned this in as an essay, and I got back the red line edit from the teacher, who gave me a little encouragement, but not much. And then for the rest of that course and for the next course, which I took from the same professor, whatever assignment he gave us, I just wrote more chapters on the Bonnet Book. And the professor did not bat an eye, and he kept helping me.
Wow.
So it came right out of a course assignment. So the first thing was that I was prompted in the night school course to start writing, and the professor continued to help me even after the course ended, and I got a note from him last week when the book won an award. The other thing that happened was that when I started doing this, my mother was about 94 and still in good health, and she had saved all of the artifacts from her mother-in-law, including the diary, which I'll show you pretty soon. And so I felt a real urgent need to go fast to get as much from my mother as I could. And someone else has asked me who the most interesting person was that I interviewed and worked with on the book, and it was actually my own mother. She kept coming up with things every day, and we'd be someplace and it would jog a memory. She was in perfect mental health. And so one of the reasons the book is so in the present time of around 1900 was because she was recalling things from her childhood that went into this book.
Wow, that's amazing. I remember reading at the end where it says, one morning in Texas, in March 2015, Mary Kay Menees, my mother, sat up in bed shouting, "Brush arbor, Nancy, brush arbor."
Right.
And that's what began the journey to uncover as much reality as possible for Blanche's story. And I thought that was just great.
Yeah, and that's the first chapter in the book.
Yeah. And I really felt connected to the characters. It was such an inspiring story to see her, how she, as a woman in that time, made her way, and made the decisions. And I really think that came to life in your book. So you said you kind of felt the beads of sweat when you were writing the complete, all the book. Did you try to put yourself as much in Blanche's shoes as possible? Did that happen quite a bit?
Several things happened. Once I started writing this book, I knew I had to write it for the truth of the story. Mm-hmm. And only later did I decide to call it a historical novel, because there were places where I had to fill in around the truth. And I recently reviewed 3 Cups of Tea by Greg Mortensen, and he said he was telling a true story, and there was a lot of it that wasn't true. And that has followed him in the rest of his career. And I didn't want to be in that situation. I didn't want people to say you're telling a true story and there are things that are not true in there. So I did call it a novel. But as we talk here, you will see that almost the entire book is a true story. Another thing is that when I started this story, this book, this writing, I made a promise to myself. And the promise that I made was that I had to portray all of my family members with integrity. I could not lie about them. I could not make up false things that would make their personality be different than it was. And so what I had to do was, like, I knew my grandmother in her older life, but not in her younger life. So I had to pull the younger life back out in the story. And I had my mother to help me. For instance, she met Bonnie before she got married in 1943. So she knew Bonnie in her middle age. So I could pull Bonnie back to middle age for sure through the eyes of my mother. And then to pull her back farther into her young age when she decided to teach herself to read, I just had to go with my gut instincts and my bloodline and what I knew about my grandmother. And I think that I'm pretty accurate. And I must tell you that I don't know that I believe in ghosts, but there were 4 or 5 times during the writing of this book when I felt her spirit guiding me. In other words, I woke up in the morning and words were coming out of me. The words describing all of the fabric, the different qualities of the fabric when she was learning about that. I didn't even know those fabrics. I jumped out of bed and ran to my desk and started writing all that down. And then I sat there and said, where did this come from? And I just felt that she was sitting on my shoulder. And I felt that this story did not get told during her lifetime. And somehow her spirit was very pleased that I was telling this story.
Wow, that's great. Yeah, it just seems like when I read the book, I feel like she's present. It's not like you're telling about someone else. You know what I'm saying? It's weird for me to say that. I don't know how quite to feel it, but it feels like she's present and that she pushes the story forward. And it's even when you switch to another character for briefly, I feel that she's with that character. It's like it's just to lead up to her guiding the story. So you said you put a lot of research into this, and I don't want to. I want people to read all of your chapter by chapter research because it's very fascinating. But when you visited a lot of places,
Yes, I did.
to write this book. Could you talk about some places that you visited that
Well,
really?
let's talk about Oklahoma. Let's talk about Oklahoma. I'll tell you a couple of stories about Oklahoma. We originally thought that she had gone to Texas, and my mother and I went to Texas, and we could never find any single information about her in Texas. We rented a car and drove over to Oklahoma. So we drove over in a rainstorm. It took us a whole day. And as we got into Oklahoma, there were these ravines off on the side of the road, and they were full of those redbud trees. And
Wow.
I'm a plant lover from way back. And these redbud trees just welcomed me into Oklahoma. So of course they had to play a place in the story. And for those of you who have read the story, or those of you who have not, it's the betrothal scene that takes place in the redbud trees. So that's one thing about Oklahoma. On my first visit to Oklahoma, I did go to Muskogee, and I spent a lot of time in your library.
Yeah.
Nancy Calhoun and Nancy Lassiter. And there were periods in Oklahoma where Bonnie was sitting right on my shoulder. I woke up one morning in the motel and I said, I think she went to a park after the wedding. And I went back to your library and I said to these two women, was there a very famous and beautiful park here in Muskogee? And they both sort of blanched and said, oh my word. And there was a park, but it was sold and demolished in 1929. But they got out books and showed me the gorgeous pictures of this park. So she may have gone to that.
Well, yeah, and I believe two of our former coworkers, both Nancy's, ironically, helped you with that, right? Nancy Calhoun and Nancy Lassiter. Nancy Lassiter, unfortunately, passed away a couple of years ago. Nancy Calhoun is in still in Oklahoma City, I believe, around there. I did invite her, and I was hoping she'd pop in. Well, maybe she will. We'll see.
Make sure she gets a copy of the recording.
I will. I've already told her about the book, and Jerry, who worked here at the time too, has sent her a copy too of it. So she knows about it, and but yes, I think that is very interesting, that connection, and I'm so happy. Just as an aside here, that we were able to help with that.
Yes. Very much so. There were many other things that happened. I went in the Three Rivers Museum and I saw some fabric in there that I really liked. And that fabric that I saw ended up being a blouse that she made during the book. I went back to Oklahoma near the end of my research and stayed in a hotel and spent 3 or 4 days at the Oklahoma City County Historical Society, their big building, which takes up a whole block. And one day I hired a taxi to drive me all around the city and up in the hills where she might have ridden to the ranch that I reference in the book. And it was storming like mad. And I came to realize that when it rains in Oklahoma, the creeks run red.
Well, yeah, that's wow. So I don't really have I have some notes, but I don't have an order necessarily. I understand that you have some things to show us, and I want to be sure we get to that because my brain jumps from one thing to another. And could you show us? You have her original diary, correct?
Yes, I do. It's right here. I'm going to put this. I don't know where you can see it. So this is the 118-year-old diary. Can you see it? Is it in the picture?
Wow, yes. Okay. Yes.
So this is a little address book. You can see how worn and tattered it is. There's no cover on one side. Here is a page, and you can see can you see the sketches of the hats? So yeah. There are 40 pages like this. You can see some of them are not as clear. They're smudged and things. So here's more pages. So I transcribed the entire text in the book so that I would have this information. And here's something else I did. Can you see this? I went back and I sketched over the hats. I blew up pages of it. And then in the book, can you see these sketches?
Yes,
So
yes.
those are my sketches that are based on her sketches. And if you will notice in the book, on the exact page where she starts writing in the journal, when she is at the Rosenthal Sloan hat making workshop, there are these little squiggles in the book, and they are called time sequence breaks. And at the very moment she starts writing in her Bonnet Book diary, in this little diary here, the squiggles in the book change to the dwarf hats.
Yes, I saw that. Yes.
I don't know if anybody picked up on that.
Well, I noticed the hats. I don't think I immediately noticed. But then as I was reading, and I was like, those are hats now.
Those were her hats, and I decided to do that, and that's right. If you look in the chapter called the Bonnet Book, that's right in the first time sequence change that happens after the journal is introduced is where the cartoon hats show up. So that's really interesting. So this little book I keep on under lock and key, and when I travel, I probably will not take it with me. It's really too valuable. So this is 118 years old.
Goodness.
Now the significant thing, if you are into pure genealogy research, there are things called primary sources. And so this is a primary source. And also these are primary sources. So these are the journals of Vivian Parrish, who was the niece of Blanche. So there are about 10 pages like this. I have them in sleeves. And then my mother wrote stories about her also, and I have about 20 of those stories. So these are all what are called primary sources. So there is information taken out of all of these pages that is woven into the books. For instance, there's a sentence down here that says, Aunt Bonnie made me a red felt hat trimmed in red ribbon. Well, if you remember in the book, she made that for the little girl, the first time when the little girl came to visit her store. So the reference for that is from this journal right here. So these are all primary sources. Now another primary source, I don't have it with me, but it's in St. Louis, is the trunk. Oh wait, here, this is a better picture. Sorry.
No worries.
This is the wooden trunk. Can you see it?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so this is still in existence. My mother had it renovated. It was in bad shape. But anyway, this is in St. Louis with my family, and she was given this by someone we don't know who, but I kind of figured it out in the book. And she left this as part of her estate, and so we know that this was part of her story. And it carried the hats. And as you may or may not remember, I did a sketch on how she carried the hats. In other words, they were stacked inside of the hat. And then there was a trough on the top where she carried all of the small supplies.
Wow. So it's just, I got the feeling that it was, I felt very present in the book. I know I've said that before, that she was present. I felt very present. And I can see why now. You had a treasure trove right there.
Yes, and I'll tell you, it was an incredible mental exercise to put all this together. I had to keep spreadsheets on the time of the age of all the characters in the book, and what year they were, what age, and in what state they were. It was very complicated. And when I would get new information, some of that would change and the story would twist a little bit when something else came up. For instance, we found Blanche in a boarding house in Cobden, Illinois in April of 1910. And then we found her in the hotel registry of the Prince Rupert Hotel in Oklahoma City in May of 1910. So I had to get her in the story from April in a small town in Illinois working in a hat store to Oklahoma City, where she was living in a hotel and making hats for the state fair.
Wow, that's just it's amazing. And so when you had to write those, did you kind of talked about this a little bit? Did you find it challenging to come up with those things that you had to make up? Did you find it?
I didn't have any trouble at all.
Oh,
maybe I'm just gutsy. I don't know. For you and for your readers, I wanted to point out something at the back where the author's notes are. There is a list of 14 or 16 items, and I call those the fence posts. In other words, I had to write the story between those fence posts. And I didn't have any trouble. Sometimes I'd wake up and I'd say, oh, today was the day she learned the fabric. And as I told you, I woke up and the fabric was streaming out of my brain. And I ran to put it down on paper. One morning I woke up and the song was coming out of my brain. The song that Charlie sang to her the first time he met her. That had to do with the name Bonnie and Blanche. Pretty much, maybe this is like what movie stars do when they get into they get into character and they don't get out of character. I just was really in the mainstream of her life for 3 or 4 years while I was doing this. And I guess it shows.
Yes, it certainly does. So I want to kind of, I want to open up to some of the people here for questions. If you're on Facebook, please type your questions and we will try to get them answered for you. I do have one comment from Facebook, though. Your outfit is excellent, apparently. Could you kind of talk about your outfit a little bit?
Yes. My publisher is partly responsible. He asked me to tell him what I was going to wear when we did the book launch, and I kept telling him, well, I have this tan jacket. And he says, no, tan won't look good with pink. And then he said, you got to have something that'll show off the pink book. So I said, oh, I have a maroon jacket. So here we are. Look how nicely all these colors coordinate. So now I have a pink shirt in both short sleeve and long sleeve, and now I have 3 maroon jackets. So I'm set for all seasons of the year, and I will wear this for every event, and I'm always in coordination with my book. Now, the reason for the hat is the following. Both the publisher and I felt I needed to have a hat to emphasize the hat theme of the book, and this one is actually from the 30s. It's called a bucket hat, and the reason I got it is because it squashes down flat, and so you can put it in a suitcase. So it's not actually, if you want to see the kind of hats Blanche made, this is typical of a hat that Blanche made. So this is made out of white felt, and then it has various layers here, a blue and then a lace over that, and feathers and trinkets on the front, and a long tulle bow in the back. So this hat was made by a French woman in Texas, and it's right from the era of around 1900, the style of 1900. So these would be the kind of hats that would have been at the state fair, this and larger, with much more build-up on the top of the hat.
Wow, that's a beautiful hat. Do you have a favorite style of hat that she would have made? Is that it, or?
I don't have any of that information. I wish I did.
Yeah. So I want to kind of get into Blanche's story because it took, I don't know what I was expecting. I try not to come expecting, something, because when I do, it's different. And this one was different but it took a kind of her life was a really hard life, even though, I was expecting a hard life, but being sent away on the orphan train. And was that something you knew before, or was that something you found out later? And if so,
let me tell you the story of how that happened. So first, let me show you this. This is a typical picture of what the orphan train children wear. This was their uniform when they were put on the train. They wore a white dress, they had a white bow in their hair, they had white stockings and white shoes. And so we knew from our family records that she was given the white dress and a light blue sash and a light blue bow for her hair and white stockings and white shoes when she did the temperance poems, which she did for about 2 years before she was sent away on the orphan train. In early 1990s, my mother, Mary Kay, had been a teacher, and she had to go back and take refresher courses to keep her teaching license in Missouri. And smart Mary Kay, she took only writing courses, and all she did was write about her mother-in-law. So all the stories that I have, she wrote during these writing courses for her recertification. And the teachers started reading these stories, and they said, this woman was an orphan train child. So my mother didn't know it, and I didn't know anything about this back then. I was out here in California, and she was back in Missouri. So the teachers of the recertification courses in Missouri helped my mother research and determined that they were talking about this uniform right here, the uniform that was given to the orphan train child when she went on the train. So that's how we found out she was an orphan train child. At the time, children didn't know this. They were not called orphan train children. They were maybe just called orphans. And most of these children thought they were the only one in the world that this happened to. They didn't know that there were between 200,000 and 300,000 children shipped across the country. So
Goodness.
They were trained with 30 other children. They knew that there were 30, but they didn't know that there were 300,000. They thought they were all unique.
And so it's kind of that being sent on the orphan train that we now call it, that kind of stays with her through the entire time. You know, she kind of has some resentment, you know,
Right.
the entire time, especially when she becomes an adult.
Right.
And I just wonder, was there in the diaries that she had, did she talk about that resentment a lot?
No, there's no, I don't have any information about that. And I actually developed a lot of resentment myself when I was writing the story. And I had some language in the book that was much more harsh than what the finished book has. And I wrestled with that and with my publisher. And that was one of the cases where I had to fall back on the original promise that I had made myself, which was that my mother didn't, I questioned my mother at length, and she didn't know of any anger and resentment that had ever been talked about to her. And so I decided that I couldn't put a lot of anger and resentment into Blanche's personality because I really didn't know. And I did not want to, I didn't want to do the wrong thing. So I hinted at it, but it's not real red hot.
Right. Yeah. And I can kind of see that being a challenge where you're reading it, you're like, boy, this was awful. And you're just, you know, and then you go back to that and say, well, I don't know if that was felt as harshly as that. So I could see that. I do want to open up. We have some questions coming in, and I want, if you're here in the chat room, I'd like you to ask it if you can. If not, I know someone said their mic wasn't working, and I think this is this question. Well, the first question is, have you ever made a hat yourself?
For years and years, I made hats all through college. And they were like some of the big fluffy ones in the one picture in the book. I made them, I put fruit bowls on top, I put animals on top, and I used to have them for like skits in college and skits in high school. And I have none of them anymore. Somehow they all got given to Goodwill during various moves. And I always wondered why I did that and why I liked doing that. And it wasn't until I started writing this book that I realized it was just coming right down through my blood from my grandmother.
Well, Angela asks, the Robies seemed nice one minute, not so nice the next. Was there any information on them that didn't make it into the book? I know you said that you just gave them that name. I know that they were nicer to her in certain instances than they were in other instances. And how did you come across, I guess that's kind of what is asking, how did you portray them? Did you have?
Well, we know that they were a Jewish family, and some of that is brought up in his associations, and he uses those associations to help Blanche in the end. We know that they were from Austria, and they were now business people in St. Louis. Now, when my mother was first married to Charlie, my dad, Charlie, got a job in St. Louis, and they came to St. Louis. And the only people in St. Louis that Charlie knew were the two daughters, Ruth and Alma. And so Ruth, and I think that's the names I use in the book, Ruth and Alma, is that right? Or Beth?
I think so.
Beth and Alma.
Let me open it.
I had to change the names.
I almost said Ruby and Darling. Wait, no, those are the horses.
I think it's Beth and Alma.
Beth and Alma, I know Alma's correct, yeah.
So my mother knew them as adults. So they were in their 40s and 50s when my mother met them. And so we talked a lot about the two girls, and I backed out their child personalities from what my mother told me about them in their 50s. One of them had curly hair, and she was vivacious, and then I made her the one who had curly hair as a child and liked to wear ribbons in her hair. And then the other one was more somber and very smart, but polite and very observant. And that was the older daughter, and she became the head librarian in St. Louis and was a very well-liked person. And in both of those cases, I backed the personality of the child out of the adult that my mother described to me. Now I forgot what your question was. Oh, the Roby family. So we got other information from census documents and business directories. They did actually start a restaurant. We got that out of a business directory. And that did start near the time that was into the book. So that is true information. The addresses are all correct. We got all of those out of various business directories for the city, or real estate directories. And I didn't know them as people. I tried to portray them as stern and maybe European reserved, but I never portrayed them as outwardly vicious or mean. And you who have read the book know this. They were stern, and they did not know how to handle this, but they did not beat her.
Right. Yeah, they weren't physically harmful at all. And it just seemed like they reacted a lot to the news that she brought, especially her move to Oklahoma. And they were like, oh no. But then, in the end, they when she gets to Oklahoma, they have that scene. You have that scene in there where the Mr. Roby had called to make sure someone would meet her and help her. And so I thought that there was a nice balance there.
There's such interesting history there. I have to tell you one thing. We found the information about the man who ran the livery stable. And in the census document, he was 86 years old, and his wife, whose real name is Daisy, but I use Ruby in the book, was 28. And my publisher told me I couldn't list the ages in the book because nobody would list it. But those were the ages listed on the census document.
My goodness.
And I made the connection. It was like magnets wanting to touch each other. I made the connection that these two young women became friends because they were close to each other in age. And that answered the family question about where she got the cart and where she got the pony for the cart and how she got to have them for almost 2 years when she was in Oklahoma, when she otherwise never would have been able to afford them. So I think she makes a difference.
Right. Yeah. That does make sense. I can see where saying, and I have another comment that says, you have made the book come alive so much more. Thanks. So that was from Kenneth. He was saying that on Facebook. Says, anyone in the room, either physically, we're socially distanced apart, by the way. I'm not right next to him.
Okay.
But
we're about 15 feet apart.
yeah, we're quite a few apart. Does anyone have any questions either in the virtual room or the real room? Weird. Speak now or forever hold your peace.
Well, if there's no questions, I have a couple other things to tell you about.
Sure, go ahead.
At the bottom of this picture is the Meadowbrook cart. I wanted to point this out to you. So we do not actually know what the cart was that she had. That's one more reason why the book is called historical fiction. So I researched this very carefully, and there are only 2 or 3 people in the United States who restore historical carts. And one of them was down in Santa Barbara. So I contacted the man in Santa Barbara and I asked if I could come visit him, and he said, sure. So I took a train down and took notes on the train and used my train observations in the book. And I rented a car in Santa Barbara and I went out and spent 3 days with him. He was about 30 or 40 minutes out of the town of Santa Barbara in a little town out in the mountains called Live Oak. And he walked me around and showed me various carts. And he pulled out 3. I told him the story and I explained to him that it was a small cart for one woman who was a hat maker. And he pulled out 3 carts and I automatically went to this one, which was the Meadowbrook cart. And I don't have a picture that's as cute as this one. I have some pictures, but he had one just like this one, except that it had slats in front instead of a solid board. And if you remember during the runaway scene, the dirt was coming in through the slats on the front of the cart. But I automatically gravitated to this one. And then I did further research, and this cart was around in 1900. So it's very possible that this is actually the right one that I picked. Once again, it's just kind of my bloodline and my spiritual guidance making it happen. And in one of my mother's stories, she references and says that the name of the pony was Daisy. So we actually know that the pony on the cart that she had in Oklahoma was named Daisy. And so Daisy has her real name in the book.
Wow. You didn't have to change the name of the horses, so to protect the. Beth and Angela were talking in the chat in the room, and Beth, why don't you pop on and ask the question that you both are asking? Put you on the spot, Beth.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Hi, Nancy. It's nice to meet you.
Yeah, it's nice to see your face.
I just wanted you to know that I really enjoyed this book. And like Angela, I hope there's a sequel.
Is there a sequel? That's the question. Is there going to be a sequel?
I hope so.
Yeah, so you're wondering if there's a sequel.
Yes.
No, there's not a sequel, but my brother wants to write the next book about her. I will tell you a little bit about the next part of her life. So after they went back to Cobden for the wedding reception, then Charlie was transferred by Marshall Fields to Springfield, Illinois. And they lived in Springfield in a hotel for about 3 years. And he was still a traveling salesman, but they were back in Illinois. And she lived in a hotel room, and she took piano lessons to learn piano, and she visited the libraries and read a lot of books, and she learned a little more about sewing during that time. Then they found a store to buy in the town of Virginia, Illinois. It was a dry goods store, and so I hinted in the book that this was kind of a thought they had early on, and it probably maybe was a way to mesh their 2 interests. So they bought this store, and they had the store for another about 65 years. And Charlie died somewhat young. He died at age 50. And she ran the store till she was about 89. So she ran the store another, 35 or 40 years after her husband died.
Wow.
She became an incredible pillar of the community. And she graduated from Hats. When Hats went out of style, when her husband was younger, he got her a scholarship to go to St. Louis to learn how to fit brassieres and girdles. And so then she became a specialist in the whole state of Illinois for fitting brassieres and girdles. And she had a huge stock of these in the back of her store. And she had a special fitting room where she would take the ladies, and they would go in there, and Blanche would spend some time taking measurements, and a lot of tales were told in that little room. And Blanche carried with her all of the secrets of Illinois that were told in that little back room. And so we don't know them, but everybody knew about this, knew that Blanche was the repository for a lot of the history and the oral, aches and pains of the town and maybe the county. And she just became a revered person in the community for the rest of her life. They had Aunt Bonnie Day. She did a drawing every Saturday night in her store. It was a little square, and you would walk around the store, and you could put 25 cents down on your blanket. And if you put 25 cents down, you could write a drawing ticket. And so all these farm people would come in and promenade around the square at night and Saturday night, and they would usually have a child draw out the winning ticket. Sometimes I got to do it. They had a big spinning thing with screen on it that the tickets were inside. And there would be 50 or 75 people right outside the store waiting for the ticket to draw. So back in the time of the Depression and when people didn't have much money, she was kind of an entertainment for the town, as well as the mother confessor and, such a pillar of the community. And that was the case until she died. She was very much loved.
Well, and what I noticed too was that she did have a strength. There was a strength about her. She wasn't going to accept things, especially when she became an adult. She was like, "No, you're not going to tell me what to do. I'm going to make my own path." And in fact, even when Charlie is introduced, she kind of had a little bit of a problem with him making these decisions for her.
Right, I know. I just had to put all that together in my head, and she was sitting on my shoulder when I was writing this stuff. She had to have inner strength. She was tossed into a strange city by herself. Many other children were too, 300,000, but this is a story. This is interesting for you to know. There are many stories about real orphan train children, but for the most part, they tell you the family that adopted them and they tell you who they married. No one writes about what happened between the adoption and when they got married because no one has that information. And these children could not write stories. So I did it from my heart and from these diaries, and just I put all the family information together, and I just did the best I could. And I had her grow from a position of self-learning and book learning at age 14 and pulling herself up from there.
Goodness, that's it's amazing. I always want to write my story, somehow, or a family story. And I have stories and essays that people have written about them. And I couldn't imagine, though, trying to write. I would have to need a muse like you have, like Blanche on your shoulder, or Blanche or Bonnie. I guess I should say now Bonnie, that on my shoulder to do that, because. So I have such an admiration for you in doing that. So
well, thank you. Let me just share this with you. So can you see the award on this book up here, right here? So just last week, this book won its first award, and it was a company called Northern California Publishers and Authors, and it's a company that's a society that's been in existence for 30 years, and they encourage independent publishers and independent authors. And this book was in a category called Children and Young Adults, and it was the only award given in this category. And it was the Young Adult Award for the development of the young personality that's in the book. And for the most part, I have not talked much about that, although I am talking about it now, because everybody wants to hear about the orphan train and they want to hear about hats. But it was a very delicate responsibility that I had to put this together and to do it accurately and sensitively, and from the age of a very young woman, starting at age 14.
Wow.
I don't think a man could have written this.
Well, yeah, I could, yeah, I don't think so. I don't think so. As a man, I could say, no, I don't think so.
So at any rate, I'm very thrilled to have an award that focuses on a thread of development in the book that so far has not gotten much attention, which is her development as a young woman.
Yeah. So Liz has raised her hand. I love these features that I don't know about in Google Meet. So Liz, what do you want to ask or speak about? Are you there?
Okay,
In the book, you mentioned a lot about the suitors of the time.
Yes.
And the young men that approached her and how she behaved. How did you research her mannerisms for the time in that period for the young woman?
My mother gave me these. She read every chapter as I wrote them. She sat and watched me write many of these chapters up at my summer cabin at Lake Tahoe. And then some of them she would read just after I wrote them, and we would talk through things like these mannerisms. And although it was a generation before my mother, she was 96 when she was telling me these things, but she could remember. She would say, well, back in the Victorian era that Blanche was in, it was really significant if you put your arm in a man's elbow. And that had a lot of meaning. And so you need to use that very carefully. And then she said, back in that era, people kissed twice and they got engaged. So I sort of asked her, what do I put in the courtship? And she said, not much. Back in that era, these women were never left alone. So there was not much in the courtship. Probably a kiss and a tingle, and that was about it. So if you've read my courtship chapter, there are 2 kisses and some tingles, and that's it.
I really, that's great, and I love how it is very appropriate. And going back to the young adult thing, it is very appropriate for young adults, and it's a very good story, I think, for teens and young adults and adults, people of all ages. And so what category do you put this in? Do you put the book in?
Well, it depends on if I'm submitting it for an award, it depends on what categories they have. Different companies have different things. For instance, in the one it just won an award in, the category called children and young adults was one category. And it was A or B, children or young adults. So I checked B. Mostly, I call it historical fiction. If I have a chance to list both, then I list it as historical fiction and young adult. I can also list it as historical biography, which it is. It's not an autobiography, but it is a biography. So that's what I call it. But then when I give a presentation, and when you read the front, the preface, and the author's notes at the end, you realize that it's a much more personal book than a historical novel.
Right, yeah. Are there any other questions?
Let's see, here's one more show and tell thing I can show you.
Okay, awesome.
This is the original letter. So this is the letter that she got at the end of the book. So it's all here. I transcribed this whole thing. Her father was a teacher. I had 2 chapters about her father, but I had to cut the chapters out. But this is the original letter. So this is also 118 years old. So this is another piece of primary source, is what this is. And at the end of this letter, he says, there's a comment that's right in the book. It says, your big brothers just wish that they could see you and tussle with you on the living room floor. So I took some of the emotion and the descriptions that were in this letter, and they're right in the end, in that chapter where she reads this letter in the book. So this is another primary source, and it has the 1911 date on the front. And I just noticed today for the first time that it says on the back, it says Box 45, Oroville, Illinois. That's the address on the back of the envelope. So this is 118 years old.
You almost, I wouldn't even want to touch it. It's, I would say it's remarkable courage to touch it and hold it up to the.
I ordered these white gloves, and for a few times I used them, but I can't even turn the pages on these things. I can't turn the pages on this little book with those white gloves on. So I'm not wearing them, and I'm being a little foolhardy. But at any rate.
Oh, but it's so neat. It's like you're touching a piece of your history, and
Yes, I know.
And that's excellent. Are there any other questions? And I'll get to my final question I have for you. But I want to make sure I get everybody. I also have to say, Kenneth says congratulations on your award winning.
Thank you.
And he also says, I almost have to read it again after learning all this. It just opened my eyes.
Listen, here's what happens. Let me tell you this, and then I want to show you one more picture. I also wrote it to be a movie. I thought it could be a movie, and I pulled it forward. And what happens is that the first time you read the book, you want to see what happens. And so you maybe read the book fast. People have told me this because they want to know how Blanche ends up. But then they read the author's notes at the end of the book, and then they think to themselves, gee, there was more in that chapter than I read when I moved quickly through the book. And so many people I know are reading this book twice, just as you just commented. So they're doing it for two reasons. One for drama, and then one for sort of historic notation.
Wow, that's great.
And I wanted to show you this. Several people have asked me if I knew my grandmother. I don't know why they wonder if I knew her. This is my grandmother when she was 94, and I'm holding my son, and I'm probably about 37 in that picture. He's turning 40 in November, my son is. So I just wanted you to see this. Here she is at 94. Look at that straight back.
Wow.
Look at that. That's that good old Midwestern pioneer stock.
Wow.
Tough and sturdy.
So, and Linda, who is in the meeting, said archivists don't even use white gloves, so you're probably okay.
It's hard, you can't turn the pages.
Yeah. Any other questions before I float my final question? Okay, well, so my final question is, and it may be a really short answer, but what are you working on now?
Oh, I'm working on two things. I've had a cabin up at Lake Tahoe for 20 years. I bought it in 99. And you may or may not know, I don't know that it shows in the book, but I was a landscape architect, a licensed landscape architect. That's what I have my degree in. And I'm a plant lover, and I have been a plant lover all of my life. And when I was young, before I got married, I got a master's degree in ecosystems management. So I learned to look at the bigger picture of how natural environments work and fit together. And I used that a lot in my career. I was a specialist in the oak woodlands of California and did land planning projects related to California's oak woodlands. I bought a house up at Lake Tahoe, and I was really interested in the environmental aspects of Lake Tahoe and the animals and the weather, the storms as they come up the lake and nestled in the Sierra Mountains, etc. So what I'm doing right now is I'm doing a set of environmental coloring books, and I started them for my grandchildren. So I have written the first two coloring books, and this is just this is to show you, this is the cover of the second one. It's called Tahoe Mountain Chickadee. And I have found a wonderful, wonderful artist who's helping me. Anyway, I'm not going to spend much time on this, but so the first two coloring books are finished, and the artist is making changes, and they will be published later this fall. And I have to submit them to the Government Trademark Society in January in order to finalize my trademark for the name. And
Wow.
And then as soon as I finish those, I'm going back to the soccer book. And on the soccer book, my husband and I managed 60 boys for 10 years. And sometimes before a game, there were 2 teams sleeping in my house. So there were 60 boys, 30 boys sleeping in my house some nights. And I was the only woman involved, and I was scared to death. And I kept notes on file cards, and then I wrote 1,000 pages about it. And I have now put that into a book. And when I went to Stanford, I went to try to publish the soccer book. But as I already told you, it got sidetracked on my grandmother.
Okay. Your grandmother wouldn't get off your shoulder.
Right. So I've already turned the soccer book. It's called Soccer Central. And I've already turned that over to my publisher. And he's already done some work on it, but I haven't even looked at it. So when I get the coloring books done, and when I get whatever else I need to do on the Bonnet Book, then I will get back to Soccer Central.
Awesome. You got your hands in so many things. That's really cool. That's awesome. So is there anything else you would like to share to close out that you want to share? Is there anything else you'd like to share?
Sometimes people ask me if I've written myself into this book. I cannot say that I have written myself into this book. I wrote my dad into the book. Interestingly enough, my mother helped me, but I didn't write her into the book. But she's on every page. But Angus McGregor, the bookman in the market, in the market, that's my dad.
Oh, wow. Cool. That's awesome.
So the tweed jackets and the pipes, that's my dad.
Wow. That's awesome.
My dad. Yeah.
The great personal touch. That's awesome. That's good to know. So I may have to read it again too. Just to knowing this information now, to put that in there. Nancy, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I really appreciate you taking the time. It was a great read. For those watching on Facebook, highly recommended by me is the Bonnet Book. Nancy Menees, right? And that's how that correct?
Not Menees, but Menees.
Menees. So I'm doing the Okie way of saying it. Menees Hardesty, Nancy Menees Hardesty, the Bonnet Book, and you pick it up. We have a few that we have bought, and we may be giving them away. So you may see a giveaway in the future for a couple of them that we have bought. So, and of course, we have it here at the library. You can check it out. So
terrific. Well, I'll tell you, I have wonderful memories of Oklahoma. And Oklahoma is about the last 1/3 of the book. And Oklahoma is where she came into her womanhood. And she came into her self-confidence as a hat maker. And I just feel that everybody in Oklahoma that helped me with the history helped me round out the picture of how Oklahoma supported her as a young woman. I don't think she had any bad experiences in Oklahoma. They were all very positive.
That's
so I have
great.
all of you to thank for the heritage that Oklahoma brings to my book.
Well, also, and it's a great book and well researched. I'm so glad, and it's important for libraries. It's important to hear these stories about the importance that libraries play. And I know I bring it back to a library, but this is what we do. We're here to serve people and how we can. And it warms my heart to know that we were able to help you so much. And
very much.
Anyway, thank you so much, Ms. Hardesty. It's great. Linda says this was great, and thank you for sharing from Beth. And thank you so much. We've really enjoyed.
You're very welcome. I've enjoyed it also.